best podcast, the Heidelcast.
It's a Heidelminicast. And now, Scott Clark.
The question for today's episode is, what resources do Christians have to combat a government that gets out of control?
If the Heidelcast helps you, won't you help us keep it going? Please make the coffer clink by clicking on the PayPal link or by sending a check to Heidelberg Reformation Association, 1637 East Valley Parkway, number 391, Escondido, California, 92027.
As a matter of principle, Christians have been concerned about what to do about a government that loses track of its responsibility to the people, a government that becomes abusive, a government that goes beyond the boundaries within which it should live. Americans are especially concerned about this. These are the kinds of questions that led to the formation of the American Republic. And the question that Christians have, and I guess particularly Reformed Christians have, is what resources do we have to think about these and to restrain a government that gets out of control?
The Heidelcast.
Well, we have some resources, and they don't include so-called Christian nationalism. If you don't know what that is, check out the Heidelblog resources and the Heidelcast series on Christian nationalism, heidelblog.net/Christian-nationalism. I know it's kind of a clunky way to get there, but I couldn't figure out how to abbreviate that in a way that people could still tell what it is. I could have said CN, but that might be a little inside baseball. So I won't go through what Christian nationalism is here, but check out that series if you want to know more about it. I interacted at length with a statement published mostly by Baptists, but I think that reflects a way that a lot of Reformed people, at least some Reformed people, are thinking about these issues at some length, went all the way through it from beginning to end. So another way that people are responding to a government that gets out of control is to become theonomists, and that is to attempt to bring back and to ask the government or demand that the government or expect that the government should reimpose the Mosaic judicial laws. I've had some people come at me recently on social media alleging that I am misrepresenting theonomy, and if you think that what I just said is a misrepresentation, I'm sorry, you don't know what you're talking about. That is the definition of theonomy. Okay, there's capital T theonomy, which says the law of God as a general category is superior to the law of man. Well, that's not in question, right? So I don't want to hear about that. Yes, that's Van Til used that language. He said he was a theonomist in that sense, but that's not the sense in which anybody's been discussing this question for the last almost 50 years now. After all, even that notorious liberal Paul Tillich, if you don't know who he is, just understand that Tillich was sort of the court theologian of the Kennedy administration back in the 60s, and certainly no theological conservative, certainly no one that would be candidating for a pulpit in any Bible-believing congregation. And Tillich said that we have to choose between autonomy and theonomy, and he wasn't talking about the Mosaic judicial laws. So what the theonomists are proposing is that, in effect, though they don't like to admit this, the Westminster Confession is wrong when it says that the judicial laws expired with the state of that people, which is what all the Reformed confessed, with a few exceptions. I only really know of one. Late 16th century English Presbyterian, Cartwright, may have been a theonomist. I don't know that for a fact, but I have read quotations and read things that suggested that he may have been that. But theonomy is a radical idea, which, to the best of my knowledge, was first really formulated by Andreas von Bodenstein-Karlstadt in the early 16th century. And he was denounced for it in the Augsburg Confession, Lutheran Confession in 1530. He was denounced by the Reformed, and so you can see all this stuff. It's the Second Helvetic Confession has a whole section basically aimed at Andreas von Bodenstein-Karlstadt and his early version of theonomy. I think it's in chapter 11 of the Second Helvetic Confession. You can find all that at heidelblog.net/confessions. You can see it there, and you can see our resources on theonomy and Christian Reconstructionism and what I have frequently called the Theo-Recon movement, and into which I guess we need to fold the Christian nationalists as well now. So those are the kinds of things to which people are tempted to go in our time, but there's no need for it. There is an alternative. And I considered that alternative sometime back in responding to a proposal by a legal scholar, a radical legal scholar, Stanley Fish, who proposed to go back to Thomas Hobbes. And if you don't know who Thomas Hobbes was, he was a political philosopher in England. He died in 1679. He's famous for theorizing about the state of nature and proposing a very powerful central government to restrain people. He sort of took some ideas in some ways from Reformed theology. The state of nature was a corruption of the Reformed idea of the sort of prelapsarian state, and he secularized it. This was pretty widely done in the 17th century. John Locke did it too, although he took a more optimistic view of the state of nature. But Thomas Hobbes proposed that the state of nature is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And without a powerful central government, which he called the Leviathan, there would be a war of all against all. And if you've paid attention at all to what's happened in this country since 2019 or 2020, you think about the riots and the Chaz, development in, I think was at Seattle, and these autonomous zones created by social radicals in major metropolitan areas, including the nation's capital, remarkably. So if you think about that kind of stuff and the fires, the riots, the looting, the bombing, think about how hard it can be in some major metropolitan areas when people get upset. They take over freeways and they lock them down for hours at a time. And anyway, that kind of thing, we saw some of that in San Diego back then. And I had friends who were the object of Molotov cocktails and bricks and things. Somebody was hit on the head with a rock or a brick that was thrown during a riot. So things can get out of hand, and when you see that, you realize, oh well, okay, maybe you think maybe Hobbes had a point. So the Stanley Fish is a radical legal theorist. He's a deconstructionist. He's famous for writing a book, title of which was "There is no text in this class, and it's a good thing too." His theory was that the words mean whatever you want them to mean, basically. And he's proposing to go back to Thomas Hobbes, the Leviathan, whale-like civil authority, is precisely why the founders said we hold these truths to be self-evident. And they appealed to the laws of nature and of nature's God and to the consent of the governed. So these are the American alternatives to Christian nationalism, to theonomy, theocracy, which is really Christian nationalism, and to Christian Reconstructionism. These are the alternatives to Andreas von Bodenstein Karlstadt's theory, that we need to take over the government, maybe even by force, and institute the Mosaic judicial laws, conquer all our enemies, and usher in a glorious reign of Christ on the earth. That was his theory. Again, take a look at the Second Helvetic Confession, which denounces this very thing in very clear terms. So, but that last phrase that I read from the American answer, the consent of the governed, is actually grounded in medieval constitutional theory, which was sort of the secular version of conciliar theory that flourished in the high and late medieval periods, in which they said, in conciliar theory, they said that the synods or the councils are a counterbalance to the papacy. And in fact, authority really comes from God through the councils to the Pope. And of course, ultimately, as you may know, the popes won that fight, and they said no, authority comes from God through the Pope and to the councils. But there was that theory, and there was a secular version of it as well. And you see the results of it in the United States. We have legislative bodies, and we say authority in the Declaration comes from God, but it is mediated through legislative bodies that make laws. Well, we don't have kings, right? We don't have a hierarchical government. We have a government of checks and balances. We have three bodies in our government. We have courts, and we have the administration, and we have the legislature. The legislature makes the laws, the courts rule on the laws, and the administration is supposed to execute the laws. Not make them, but to execute them. So we've been thinking about these things for a long time, and we've been thinking about them in a way that doesn't have anything to do with theocracy, theonomy, Christian Reconstructionism, or any of those radical theories.
Call or text now, 760-618-1563.
To be sure, our founders were indebted to the Enlightenment, but they did a good job of borrowing from older Christian language from the medieval and even some Reformation era, thinking of John Locke, or at least period of Christian orthodoxy. Not to say that Locke was entirely orthodox in his theology. I don't think that he was. There have been people who tried to make him into a more orthodox theologian than he was. I don't think he was. But they were certainly heavily influenced by his second treatise on civil government. And Locke was certainly borrowing from various theories about resistance to tyrants and so forth that had been developed in the 16th and 17th centuries. Locke was at Oxford about the same time as John Owen, if that helps you place him at all. And he became very influential in the New World. So they used that language from Locke and others to establish a case against George III. You know, by the way, people sometimes say, well, you're a two-kingdom guy, more accurately, a twofold kingdom guy. I'm just trying to appropriate Calvin's language and theory of two kingdom, or of a twofold kingdom, one kingdom with two spheres. Such a radical thing. People call it radical. No, what's radical is planning to and talking about overthrowing the United States and overthrowing the American Constitution. That's radical. But they, as I say, they secularized their appropriation of some Christian ideas. You know, as I've tried to remind you, and as I basically learned from Darrell Hart in his book, A Secular Faith, the idea of secular is not inherently evil or wicked. The adjective secular, as I've mentioned many times, is derived from a Latin noun, saeculum. And it doesn't mean anti-theistic or atheistic or evil or wicked or devilish. The word secular means non-ecclesiastical. And so if ecclesiastical refers to the sacred, then the secular describes that realm that is common to all image bearers. And it seems to me that Abraham Kuyper talked about that very thing. So I don't think it's all that radical. The ideas of a transcendent natural law of divine origin and authority that flows from God through the governed and from there to the magistrate. Of course, these ideas predate the Reformation, but they became especially potent in the 16th century as both Lutherans and Reformed writers began to articulate a theory of natural law. Again, I understand this may be an idea that's somewhat foreign. It's not an idea with which everyone may be familiar, and there are some Reformed people who've been given the idea, unfortunately, that natural law entails autonomy, which is certainly not true. It's certainly not the traditional Reformed view of natural law. It's not the traditional Christian view of natural law. So there were people in the 17th century. It was a Dutch scholar of some considerable skill and repute, Hugo Grotius, who was sympathetic with the Remonstrants and possibly with the Socinians, who wrote about natural law. And sometimes people trace natural law directly to Grotius, and then they stopped there as if he invented natural law and he's the only one who ever talked about it. Well, that simply would not be true or accurate at all. Calvin was writing about natural law 100 years before Grotius, and before that, centuries before that, lots of Christians had written about natural law. Thomas Aquinas, of whom no reasonable person who's ever paid 5 minutes of attention to Thomas could think that Thomas believed in human autonomy. So if somebody's telling you that, they clearly are confused and really no serious idea what they're talking about.
The best podcast, the Heidelcast.
Well, the Reformed picked up these ideas of natural law from the earlier Christian tradition, and they began to articulate a theory. Natural law is the natural revelation of the substance of the moral law, or the Ten Commandments, and they used it as the basis of their resistance to tyrants. In the early 1570s, Beza wrote concerning the right of magistrates, and then that was followed up by a treatise by a hitherto unknown writer. Scholars have speculated, and then maybe have narrowed it down, but anyway, the writer was intended to be anonymous. He called himself Brutus, and he wrote a treatise called Vindication Against Tyrants, which is now in English, by the way. You can read that for yourself and see the nature of the arguments. Now, these texts didn't rely only on natural law. They also appealed to the history of redemption and, I think mistakenly, conveniently blurred the line between national Israel and the 16th century state. So that was a problem. And our theology, however, tells us that we can't appeal to the Old Testament theocracy in the way they did. So that's why I say that was a mistake. And by the way, when I say that, I'm only following the theology that they taught. They just weren't consistent with their own theology. And that's what we're trying to do now, is to be more consistent with our own theology. And you can see that, for example, in Westminster Confession, chapter 19. So a few hundred years after Christendom, it's a little easier to see the distinction between the Old Testament theocracy and post-canonical civil orders. The most enduring part of the argument by resistance theorists was their appeal to a divinely revealed transcendent norm or law or rule, to which the magistrate and the governed are both bound. They understood that the civil order is not a covenant of grace, but a covenant of works. This is a distinction I think that's been lost on both the religious right and the religious left, who, in their sort of mono-covenantal politics, seem to be bent on making the civil order a covenant of grace. And thereby they hope to achieve their utopia. Hence, they hope to achieve their utopia of Christian democratic socialism or a Christian republic in America, something like that. And I say a pox on both their houses, both the religious left and the religious right, because neither one of them understands the nature of civil society as a covenant of works. So we don't need to appeal to Christian America to make our case. The founding documents, the founding American documents, are entirely sufficient evidence. It wasn't long ago that Martin Luther King invoked our founding documents in order to call Americans to practice what they professed in the Declaration. Recently, a correspondent quoted part of the famous 1963 letter from the Birmingham jail to the effect that King was a transformationalist. Well, on some level, I guess he was. He certainly confused the two kingdoms by making the visible church an agent of social change. Nevertheless, he was also an advocate of natural law. And in that same letter from a Birmingham jail, he wrote the following, and I quote, "You express a great deal of anxiety over our willingness to break laws." And then he went on to say, "The answer lies in the fact that there are two types of laws, just and unjust. I would be the first to advocate obeying just laws. One has not only a legal but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that, quote, an unjust law is not law at all, close quote. Now, what is the difference between the two, he wrote? And then he went on to say, an unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. To put it in terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in the eternal law and natural law. And that ends the quote. So it's true that King did use transformational language, but it's not entirely clear from the context that he was, despite his practice, intending to say that the visible institutional church is the agent of transformation. In fact, he was decrying the visible institutional church for being an agent of the repressive status quo. And in the letter, he seems to use the word church, and then in the passage quoted by a correspondent, to refer to members of the church as individuals. So whatever the case, the point here is to note that it wasn't long ago that somebody in America was able to make credibly a natural law argument.
Call or text now, 760-618-1563.
And that law was grounded in the Decalogue in order to make a persuasive case in the what was arguably already the late modern period. His appeal was persuasive because natural law is a truly common, I didn't say neutral, I said common truth, because it's universally known and because it's revealed by God, and it's embedded in the fabric of creation. Johannes Althusius, who died in 1638, also appealed to these creational norms and patterns in his Politics, she published in 1603. So long before Abraham Kuyper, he theorized about spheres of association and distinction between those spheres and the family as the most basic unit of association. And he did so, at least partly, on the basis of a natural or creational law. Now, that's what I'm trying to do, is to capitalize on that and say, here we have resources that we can use to make arguments to advance a case for liberty and freedom against a repressive state. Althusius obviously was no secularist in the modern sense. He taught at Herborn, which was the academy founded by my guy, Caspar Olevianus, who died in 1587. He was an Orthodox Reformed writer on political and social issues. His theories were influential in the Dutch revolt against the Spanish and well beyond. They were influential on at least some of the American founding fathers. Indeed, as I recall, the abridged English translation of the Politics, one can find almost the exact language of the 10th Amendment. He was the father of federal political theory, that is, the doctrine of graduated assemblies that derive their authority from smaller assemblies. There's a fair bit of reasonable literature arguing that there was at least some connection between Althusius' federal political theory and Reformed federal theology. Exactly what that connection was is not entirely clear, but there seems to be some connection. And it may not be something that, federal theology necessarily leads to federal politics. I don't know that at all. And I'm certainly not suggesting that Althusius made no appeal to the history of redemption. That would be foolish, since the appeal is embedded in the full title of the work. Right? So it's not just a one-word title. It has a much longer title. The heart of his argument, however, was his appeal to creation and his observation about the nature of human society. So here's a Reformed guy using his theology, as lenses, but making an argument from creation and from nature, from what he could see with his eyes, what he could observe, which is a very American thing to do in a way. This is the way the American founders proceeded. And so the heart of his argument was in this appeal to creation and his observations. And this part of the argument came before the 30 Years' War. It's a good foundation from which to build a new post-theocratic model of civil association, grounded in the nature of human society as constituted by creation. In his Politica is an interesting resource as we consider how to respond to the pendulum swinging back, as we've seen since COVID, to the Hobbesian Leviathan State.
Thanks for listening. Tune in tomorrow for more from the Heidelcast, brought to you by Heidelberg Reformation Association.org. Don't forget, when the coin in the coffer clinks, the cost of bandwidth shrinks. Copyright Heidelberg Reformation Association. All rights reserved. This is a Heidel Media production.
The best podcast